Election 2020 was one of the greatest accomplishments of American democracy. Not because of the outcome, but because the public servants who run elections somehow managed the highest turnout in American history in a divisive election in the middle of a global pandemic. They went to work every day with the risk of getting sick, and in fact, many of them did get sick. And yet, their work during the 2020 election withstood more scrutiny than any election in world history. And even as we sit here today, years later, there has still not been a shred of evidence presented that would raise questions about their work. But this incredible success wasn't inevitable.
John F. Kennedy has been elected President of the United States.
The American people have spoken, and they have spoken clearly.
That was a rigged election.
We will shut the country down.
A disinformation campaign.
We're going to hang you.
There is nowhere I feel safe.
You're not going to allow the harassment of the election workers to continue.
It has to stop.
This is The Count. I'm David Becker. Political passions were running even higher than usual in early March of 2020. With minimal remaining opposition in his own party, President Trump aimed most of his rhetoric at the Democratic field, which was quickly consolidating around Joe Biden.
You got a choice between Sleepy Joe and Crazy Bernie.
But behind the political news was an unmistakable drumbeat, a deadly virus spreading rapidly around the world. From its source in Wuhan, China, air travelers had spread the virus to several other countries. South Korea, Iran, and Italy were dealing with severe outbreaks. A cruise liner had been quarantined off the coast of Japan with 700 infected and 13 dead. To most Americans, it seemed like a faraway problem. A single U.S. case had been confirmed and isolated on January 20th. By March 1st, only 30 U.S. cases had been identified. A single death had been recorded the day before. But by the end of March, everything had changed.
Just a few minutes ago, the World Health Organization declared that the coronavirus outbreak has now reached pandemic status. If we could, I'd like to play
the U.S. closing its borders to parts of Europe and not to America.
140,000 U.S. cases of COVID-19 have been reported, and 4,000 Americans were dead. It's easy to forget the feeling of vulnerability during those early months. Health experts initially predicted that a COVID vaccine would take at least 18 months to formulate, test, and release. Meanwhile, guidelines were issued for masking, distancing, and lockdowns. And every step of the way, conspiracy theorists, many of them grifters turning fear into money, worked overtime to create chaos and uncertainty, distorting every word from health officials while flagrantly violating every guideline and encouraging others to do so. And in the middle of that unprecedented turmoil, election officials across the country had to figure out how to conduct a safe and secure national election that was already underway. COVID shut down most of the United States just days after the Super Tuesday primaries. Both the remaining primaries and the general election would take place in the shadow of a virus against which we had no immune defense that would eventually claim as many as 3,000 American lives every day. We were all sheltering in our homes. Mass gatherings were off the table, a serious problem for election officials, given that elections are mass gatherings. Considering the stakes, the tools we had to protect an unimmunized population seemed meager. Social distancing, mask wearing, hand sanitizing. So election officials began thinking outside of the box. The remaining primaries became a trial run for the November general election. Some primary elections were delayed to allow time to rethink and retool. Several states scrambled to expand mail-in voting as a safer option. Some that had previously required voters to provide a valid excuse for voting by mail relaxed these restrictions, allowing any voter to request a mail-in ballot without an excuse. Some even proactively mailed absentee ballot applications or the ballots themselves to all active registered voters. Deadlines for requesting and returning mail-in ballots were extended in some places to accommodate postal delays and the high volume of mail-in votes. And then the disinformation machine, already working overtime, turned its sights on these attempts to run a safe election. They lied that mail ballots would spread the disease faster. Then came the false claims, even from the president himself, that voting by mail is insecure, an opportunity for massive fraud. That these claims were lies, and also self-defeating for a candidate that needed every vote he could get, didn't make these claims less effective on his supporters. Execution wasn't perfect during the primaries. In some states, voting lines were long. Polling precincts in some urban areas were understaffed. Voters were sometimes confused about which precincts were open. But under astonishing pressure, election and public health officials balanced risks, adapting and performing as they went. Against unprecedented headwinds, our democracy persisted through the final primaries on August 11th, when Connecticut, Minnesota, Vermont, and Wisconsin held delayed primaries. The primaries helped election officials learn how to adapt and develop best practices, as Americans have always done during a crisis. People had legitimate fears about voting in person and in close proximity to each other. So procedures were changed, and voters were given unprecedented choices for how to vote. Larger voting sites so voters could spread out. More options to vote by mail and return mail ballots securely by Dropbox. Verifiable paper ballots were used and served their purpose, acting as a fail-safe and transparent proof against fraud, and around 95% of voters used them. Let's freeze for a moment on those paper ballots. A paper ballot is a way to record a voter's intention at the time of voting, keep it secret, but still enable us to go back to the ballot to confirm and reconfirm, count and recount. Even if the voting machines that count our ballots quickly and accurately malfunction, or if someone attempts to tamper with those machines, we can always go back to the paper ballots and confirm the real result. And we do that every time. When Georgia's 2020 election results were called into question, the statewide use of verifiable paper ballots made it possible to recount every presidential ballot 3 different times, 3 different ways, once entirely by hand. If Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger sounded confident in the numbers during the January 2nd phone call in which he was asked to, quote, find votes, one big reason was the paper ballots. That could have been a very different story.
It was the first time we had used our brand new paper ballot system, because in Georgia before 2020 we hadn't had actual paper ballots in 20 years. So it was kind of a big deal.
That's Gabriel Sterling, Chief Operating Officer for the Georgia Secretary of State's office, and a Republican, telling the story on Frontline.
So I was sitting there trying to make sure everything functioned properly, working with our elections teams, working with the counties, and again, we pulled it off because this was, with the new voting machines, it was the fastest, largest rollout of a new voting system in American history. And we wanted to make sure it ran properly in the biggest election in the middle of a pandemic with record turnout.
In 2016, just 75 to 80% of ballots cast nationwide included auditable paper. By 2020, about 95% of all U.S. ballots were paper, including every battleground state. The entire states of Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia had significant numbers of non-paper ballots in 2016, some without paper statewide. But by 2020, all had moved to entirely paper ballots. Other improvements in election security and integrity had taken place in the states over those 4 years as well. States' voter lists became even more accurate, as more states shared data with each other to learn about voters who had moved or died. Despite major challenges like insufficient funding and resources, election officials were ready heading into the 2020 election. And then COVID hit, a crisis that election officials had never experienced before and couldn't have planned for. To protect the health of voters while retaining election security, they had to reimagine our way of voting on the fly, while putting themselves at risk of contracting a potentially deadly virus. Against all odds, the hundreds of thousands of election officials and volunteers in thousands of different jurisdictions pulled it off. When they had problems during the primaries, they learned their lessons and revised their approach for the general election. When legislators failed to provide needed funding for new expenses, election officials partnered with philanthropy. When voters needed more ways to vote safely, election officials worked with their states to expand those options. When large numbers of experienced poll workers couldn't work because they were at higher risk of contracting the virus, election officials recruited and trained new workers from lower risk groups. When election officials needed larger voting locations to accommodate social distancing, they partnered with sports arenas and other large venues to ensure their voters and workers were as comfortable and safe as possible. They pulled this all off while rules and procedures were constantly in flux, changing under their feet, often challenged in court, as both political parties sought an advantage. As it turned out, Republicans won about 85% of the litigation to set the rules before the election. But whatever side you were on, everyone knew the rules by the start of the general election, and election officials around the country were ready. In November 2020, nearly 160 million Americans turned out to vote. That's 20 million more ballots than had ever been cast in any election in American history. 2 out of 3 eligible voters showed up. Even with unprecedented scrutiny, legal challenges, and unsubstantiated claims of fraud while the votes were still being counted, the work of election officials withstood that harsh scrutiny. The November 2020 election was, simply put, the most secure, transparent, and verified presidential election in American history. It's not even close. Despite being held in the middle of a global pandemic, the 2020 election stands as one of the great accomplishments of American resilience and know-how. Sterling remembers the feeling of relief on election night in the Georgia Secretary of State's office.
Everything worked. In fact, when everything finished, we were essentially in victory mode. We were doing a victory lap because everything was so smooth. Everything had gone so well. We'd already started tabulating absentee ballots, and so we were at a pretty good place. We were very happy with what had gone on that day. The counties had gotten their work done. We didn't really have any actual issues on Election Day, so we were pretty happy.
Those who had engineered this miracle of public service never really had a moment to celebrate what they'd achieved. For months, they had watched as a counterfactual story was created by those who could profit more from the lies than from the truth, and those who sought desperately to cling to power. In this fractured fairy tale, election officials were not the preventers of a civic catastrophe, but the secret architects of one. In this story, they hadn't guided a complex, nonpartisan process through the shoals of a deadly pandemic. They had leveraged the chaos of the moment to take the election from the rightful winner. As I record this, almost 4 years have passed since that election. And while there are still debunked claims of Italian satellites and German servers and bamboo ballots and dead Venezuelan dictators circulating on social media, there has still not been one shred of evidence presented to any court about any significant problems in the 2020 election. Conservative legal scholars have reviewed every claim of fraud, all of the allegations and evidence, and concluded that the 2020 election was lost, not stolen. Even efforts by well-funded and highly motivated supporters of the losing presidential candidate in places like Arizona and Wisconsin could not find or manufacture evidence that the election was not legitimate. Yet even after more than 1,400 days, the lies have not let up, and election officials have paid the biggest price. After refusing to defy his oath of office and overturn the legitimate result in Georgia's presidential election, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, his wife, and his deputy Gabe Sterling endured relentless attacks as Trump continued to spread the false claim of widespread voter fraud in Georgia. Election deniers broke into the home of Raffensperger's daughter-in-law and grandchildren. After Donald Trump falsely accused then Philadelphia City Commissioner Al Schmidt of, quote, refusing to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty, Schmidt testified before the Senate that he began receiving graphic threats.
Tell the truth or your 3 kids will be fatally shot. Included our address, included my children's names, included a picture of our home. Cops can't help you. Heads on spikes, treasonous Schmitz. You betrayed your country. You lied. You're a traitor. Rhino stole election. We steal lives.
Georgia poll worker Shay Moss and her mother Ruby Freeman received torrents of abuse and death threats after Trump and others falsely accused them of pulling fraudulent ballots from a suitcase on election night and called Freeman
a professional vote scammer and hustler.
Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani claimed the women could be seen on video,
quite obviously surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they're vials of heroin or cocaine.
Although the claims were quickly disproven by state election officials, they were actually passing ginger mints. The threats continued and intensified until Moss and Freeman, urged by the FBI, fled their homes for 2 months. On July 31st, 2022, Washoe County, Nevada Registrar Deanna Spicula walked away from a 15-year job she loved after receiving death threats based on false claims of fraud. Other Washoe County election workers reported being followed to their cars at night, having traitor shouted in their faces and their license plate numbers written down. 3 weeks later, the entire elections office of Gillespie County, Texas resigned, citing threats and dangerous misinformation. Kathy Darling Allen, clerk and registrar of voters of Shasta County, California, found a hidden surveillance camera trained on the back entrance of her office during the 2022 primary. Reuters research in 2021 counted at least 102 threats made to more than 40 election officials, workers, or their families in the months immediately following the 2020 election. Quote, each explicit enough to put a reasonable person in fear of bodily harm or death, the typical legal threshold for prosecution. The messages often included highly personal, sometimes sexualized threats of violence or death, not only to the officials themselves, but also to their family members and their children, unquote. Election workers were followed from work, trailed by cars as they tried to run errands. Some now wear body armor, while others have taken firearms training. Every Secretary of State in a 2020 battleground state received death threats, as well as in Colorado, New Jersey, and Minnesota, states that weren't even close. Armed protesters came to the home of Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, menacing her and her family. Pennsylvania Secretary of State Kathy Boockvar was told she would be killed in the middle of the night inside her home. She was forced into hiding after she announced there would be no recount of the 2020 election results, a recount that Trump had a legal right to request, but Trump himself chose not to. The morning after the January 6th insurrection, the office of Nevada's Secretary of State received 4 consecutive calls from the same person. I hope you all go to jail for treason, he said. I hope your children get molested. You're all going to effing die. The threats continued unabated. Envelopes with threatening powders were sent to election office in many states as recently as September 2024. Election officials being the target of public vitriol and terroristic threats would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. They were mostly thought of as functionaries, the bureaucrats and volunteers who formed a mostly invisible conveyor of ballots between the voter and the red-blue map on election night television screens. That's if they were thought of at all. More often, election officials were out of sight and mind. For most of American history, the administration of elections was vital but mundane work. Any anger and discontent related to election outcomes tended to focus on the political players rather than election workers. The under-the-radar status quo began to change during the 2016 election season. In a series of tweets in October 2016, Republican candidate Donald Trump questioned the legitimacy of the coming election. Of course there is large-scale voter fraud happening on and before Election Day, he wrote. The election is absolutely rigged. In the October 19th debate, moderator Chris Wallace asked Trump whether he would accept the results of the election regardless of the outcome.
Are you saying you're not prepared now to commit to that principle?
What I'm saying is that I will tell you at the time. I'll keep you in suspense.
At a rally the next day, he seemed ready to embrace the tradition of concession, but instead doubled down in a way that foreshadowed 2020.
I would like to promise and pledge to all of my voters and supporters and to all of the people of the United States that I will totally accept the results of this great and historic presidential election if I win.
As it turned out, even winning didn't change the narrative. As we saw in episode 2, Trump began to claim that massive fraud, including millions of illegal votes, had robbed him of the popular vote victory. The message landed in soil that was well prepared. By October 2016, those thousands of Russian Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts had been sowing discord and eroding trust in U.S. institutions for more than a year. Now they could largely step aside. Instead of thousands of smiling faces impersonating Americans on social media with false stories designed to destabilize American democracy, actual Americans would do the work of our adversaries, guided by a continuous flow of tweets from the highest office in the land. The deep state has corrupted the government. Elections can't be trusted. Everything is rigged. After the 2020 presidential election, 77% of Trump supporters believed Biden's win was due to fraud. A Gallup poll revealed that only 30% of Americans said they were very confident in the accuracy of the election results, a drop from 49% in 2008. In 1958, 73% of Americans trusted the government to do what is right, always or most of the time. By 2020, this figure had fallen to just 20%. Partisan division also increased. A 2019 Pew Research study showed that only 11% of Republicans trusted the government in office during the Obama administration, while trust among Democrats fell to 14% during the Trump administration. 64% of Americans said that made-up news and information significantly affected their confidence in government institutions. This loss of trust set the stage disastrously for the COVID-19 pandemic. Misinformation and conflicting messages from government officials, health officials, and partisan media led to public confusion and cynicism. In 2019, a Pew Research survey found that 83% of Americans had a positive view of the Centers for Disease Control. By April 2020, just a month into the pandemic, that had dropped to 49%. Given the context into which the 2020 election was born, a tornado of exploited fears, manipulation, and decimated trust, what chance did the truth ever have?
About a minute before 10 o'clock here in the East, and we've got Iowa, Montana, Nevada, and Utah.
On the evening of November 3rd, 2020, Americans took part in a national election tradition. The moments the polls closed, we ran to the TV for results. As minutes turned to hours, then to days, those who had been primed to suspect foul play moved from impatience to anger. What was taking so long? Just a few years back, we got results right away. They're tampering with the election. There's so much to unpack there. Let's start with the false impression that something has changed. Our national elections are complex and enormous, with as many as 160 million ballots, each with multiple pages and dozens of races. As a result, there have never been final results on a national election night, ever. We only thought we knew the final results because the margins were large enough and the exit polls definitive enough that the media could confidently tell us who would be the winner after all the ballots were officially counted. But when that happens, ballots are still being counted. The confirmed results are still days or weeks away. At no point ever in American history did we snap our fingers, count our ballots, and know the results of every race, no matter how narrow, on election night or even the following day. In every single state, it takes days or weeks to certify and confirm the results and to make them official. We've greatly improved our ability to report results quickly in the last 20 years, but the expansion of mail-in voting, particularly in response to the pandemic. And narrow margins meant in 2020 that a delay in the media's ability to call the race was virtually assured. Given the dry tinder of distrust in November 2020, even opposite situations could equally fuel conspiracy theories. For election 2020, no states capture this dynamic better than Arizona and Pennsylvania. In addition to a long history of high-volume mail-in balloting, Arizona follows the best practice of allowing ballots to be processed as they are received. This allows signatures to be verified and any irregularities to be caught and corrected by the voter before the high pressure of Election Day. Election results aren't known or reported out before the polls close, but thanks to Arizona's procedures, mail ballots arriving before Election Day can be quickly reported out on election night. Pennsylvania was a different story. The state did not have a long history of widespread mail-in voting before 2020, except for absentee ballots under specific conditions. It was only in 2019 that Pennsylvania's Act 77, passed primarily with Republican support in the legislature, allowed for no-excuse mail-in voting. But unlike Arizona, the Pennsylvania Act did not allow counties to even begin processing mail-in ballots until Election Day itself. Not just counting, but all of the signature verification, all of the checking for irregularities and correcting of those irregularities by the voters had to occur on or after Election Day. Add a pandemic with historic levels of mail-in voting, and it's obvious that Pennsylvania's count would be delayed. Given its efficiencies, Arizona, by contrast, quickly reached the point where the margin of victory in ballots counted exceeded the number of ballots still outstanding. Just before midnight Eastern Time on election night, with 80% of the vote in, Biden was up by a margin of 136,000 votes in Arizona, and Fox News and the Associated Press called the state for Biden.
The Fox News decision desk is calling Arizona for Joe Biden.
Arizona hadn't gone for the Democrats since Bill Clinton in 1996. Before that, you had to go back to Harry Truman. Combine what was perceived to be an atypical result with the unusual speed of counting, and the conspiracy theories erupted. On the other side of the country, Pennsylvania was generating an equal and opposite controversy. Not too fast, but too slow. More than 2.6 million mail-in ballots had been received, but Act 77 didn't allow any processing at all until Election Day. So throughout Election Day, and into the next day, and the next, on the blue and red maps of our television screens, the crucial swing state of Pennsylvania stubbornly remained gray.
Still in Philadelphia because they are still counting votes here in this convention center behind me.
And the conspiracy theories exploded. In Arizona, the claim was made that ballots marked with Sharpie pens were being rejected, and that Sharpies had been provided only at heavily Republican polling places. Voting machines were said to be flipping votes from Trump to Biden, and widespread voting by ineligible or dead voters was alleged. None of these claims was even remotely true, and all were quickly refuted by election officials. But it didn't matter. In Pennsylvania, the claims were late-arriving ballots illegally counted, dumping of large numbers of fake ballots in favor of one candidate, and tampering with voting machines. Again, all were quickly and provably refuted. And again, it didn't matter. The conspiracy theorists couldn't decide if states were counting too fast and needed to continue counting, or they were counting too slowly and needed to be stopped. As Trump was narrowing the margin in Arizona as more ballots were counted over the next few days, he needed them to keep counting. But as Biden was gaining ground or extending his lead in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, he wanted the counting to stop. On November 4th, one day after the election, the Trump campaign sued the Michigan Secretary of State to stop the counting of absentee ballots in that state, claiming illegal conduct. It was the first of more than 60 legal actions by the Trump campaign to challenge aspects of the 2020 election in key states. It didn't matter whether the states were counting too slowly or too fast, whether they had a particular kind of voting machine or another, whether they had a lot of mail balloting or very little. The only thing that mattered was whether Trump was winning the state. By November 5th, 2 days after the election, "Stop the Steal" was burning through right-wing media. The phrase wasn't an invention of 2020. Trump advisor Roger Stone had begun floating it in preparation of a Trump loss in 2016, until Trump won. On November 7th, Major media called the election for Joe Biden.
The Fox News decision desk can now project that former Vice President Joe Biden will win Pennsylvania and Nevada, putting him over the 270 electoral votes he needs to become the 46th president.
Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States, winning the White House and denying President Trump a second
It was at this
term.
point that a concession speech by Donald Trump might have doused the flame of anger, division, and the potential for violence. Instead, he poured gasoline on the fire, setting off a chain of events that put our republic at risk.
Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, has vowed not to concede at this point. Legal challenges will ensue over the course of Monday and beyond.
Because this election was a fraud. Just so you understand, this election was a fraud.
On November 14th, thousands of Trump supporters, including members of far-right groups, gathered in Washington, D.C. to protest the election results for the Million MAGA March. By November 27th, 30 of the campaign's lawsuits had failed. On December 1st, Attorney General William Barr stated that the Justice Department had found no evidence of widespread fraud that could change the outcome of the election, contradicting Trump's claims. 2 weeks later, Barr announced his resignation. On December 12th, the second Million MAGA March in Washington, D.C. expressed the belief among some that the election was fraudulent. On December 14th, the Electoral College formally voted to confirm Joe Biden's victory, a development many Trump supporters viewed as illegitimate. Of the more than 60 cases claiming illegality in the election, that voting machines switched votes, that thousands of ballots had been cast in the names of dead people, that using a Sharpie disqualified ballots, that truckloads of fake ballots and USB drives with fake votes were brought into counting centers, that voting machines had been hacked, that non-citizens voted in huge numbers, that legal ballots had been deliberately destroyed by Democratic partisans. Only one case was successful, a procedural question regarding the deadline to correct ballot errors in Pennsylvania. It was unrelated to fraud and only affected a few hundred ballots in a state where Biden had won by more than 84,000 votes. But disinformation about the election continued to spread across social media platforms, including claims that Trump was winning all cases, quote, where the merits are considered, unquote. January 2nd, 2021 was the now infamous phone call in which Trump pressured Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find enough votes to overturn his defeat in the state. And it was throughout this period that the election officials who had achieved the miracle of democracy of the 2020 election had their lives shattered. Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman were driven from their homes. Al Schmidt and his wife were graphically threatened with the deaths of their children. Brad Raffensperger and Gabe Sterling and their families endured relentless threats in Georgia. Armed protesters menaced the home of Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. Pennsylvania Secretary of State Kathy Bookfar was told she would be killed in her home. Scores of others across the country were threatened, followed, harassed, and terrorized simply for doing their jobs. And then, 4 days after the Georgia phone call, during the counting of electoral votes in Congress, thousands of people who had been radicalized by months and years of lies, convinced that they had been robbed of their fundamental democratic rights, stormed the U.S. Capitol. Faith in our democracy is broken. How do we go about putting it back together?
David Becker is the founder and executive director of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research, working with election officials of both parties to ensure accessible, secure elections for all eligible voters. He also manages the Election Official Legal Defense Network, providing pro bono legal assistance to election officials who are threatened with frivolous criminal prosecution, harassment, or physical violence. He has served as director of the elections program at the Pew Charitable Trusts and was a senior trial attorney in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. David serves as election law expert for CBS News and is the co-author with CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett of the book The Big Truth: Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. If you'd like to support the important work of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, promoting elections that voters should and do trust, visit electioninnovation.org/donate. The Count with David Becker is a production of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Learn more at electioninnovation.org.